A quiet harbor rests under a gray sky. Wooden ships move gently with the tide. The air smells of salt and smoke. On the deck of one ship, heavy wooden chests sit in neat rows. They look ordinary, but inside them is something small and dry. It is not gold. It is not silver. It is tea, a simple leaf, brown and fragile, light enough to float in hot water. But this tea would change the world. It would divide friends. It would start a war. Few people knew how serious the moment was. The harbor was quiet. The city nearby was calm. Men walked along the docks. They spoke in low voices. Their faces were tense. They were not sailors. They were not merchants. They were waiting. The year was 1773. The place was Boston in the American colonies. The British flag still flew above the town. At this time, America was not yet a country. It was a group of colonies ruled by Britain. Far across the ocean, the King of Britain was powerful. His name was King George III. His decisions reached across the sea. Britain had many colonies. They sent raw materials back to Europe. In return, they bought British goods. This system made Britain rich. But life in the colonies was changing. People were beginning to question it. The colonists worked hard. They built farms, towns, and ports. They believed they deserved a voice. But the strange part was, they had no representatives in the British Parliament. They could not vote on British laws. Still, British laws shaped their lives. They controlled trade. They controlled taxes. And taxes were the heart of the problem. After a long and expensive war in Europe, Britain needed money. A lot of money. The war had protected the colonies from French forces, but it had also left Britain deeply in debt. The king looked toward America. He believed the colonies should help pay. After all, they had benefited from protection. So new taxes were created. First came the Stamp Act. It placed a tax on printed paper. Newspapers, documents, even playing cards. Colonists were angry. They had not agreed to this tax. They called it unfair. They began to say a simple phrase: taxation without representation. The word spread quickly. Protests filled the streets. Crowds gathered outside government buildings. Voices grew louder. Britain removed some taxes, but not all. The tension did not disappear. Soon, new taxes replaced the old ones. The Townshend Acts taxed glass, paper, paint, and tea. Tea was included again. Tea was not a luxury for the rich. It was part of daily life. Families drank it every day. In small kitchens, water boiled in iron pots. Tea leaves were poured into cups. Conversations began. Tea connected people. It was warm and comforting. It felt harmless. But behind each cup was a tax. A small amount of money, paid to the British government. Some colonists decided to resist. They stopped buying British goods. They organized boycotts. Shops stood empty. British imports sat unsold. Merchants worried. Smugglers brought in tea from other countries. It was cheaper, and it avoided British taxes. Britain saw this as a problem. Its powerful East India Company was losing money, huge amounts of money. The company had ships full of tea. Warehouses were packed. No one was buying enough. So Parliament passed a new law in 1773. It was called the Tea Act. It changed everything. The Tea Act lowered the price of British tea. It made it cheaper than smuggled tea. At first, it seemed helpful, but the tax was still there, hidden inside the price, quiet but real. Colonists understood the message. If they accepted this cheap tea, they accepted Parliament's right to tax them. It was not about the money anymore. It was about control. It was about power. Ships carrying tea began to cross the Atlantic. They sailed toward American ports. Boston was one of them. In late November 1773, 3 ships arrived in Boston Harbor. They carried hundreds of chests of tea. The ships were named Dartmouth, Eleanor, and Beaver. They waited in the cold water, their cargo untouched. Crowds gathered along the docks. People watched in silence. Some whispered in anger. Local leaders met in town halls. They spoke about rights and freedom. The mood was serious. One man stood out among them. His name was Samuel Adams. He believed strongly in resistance. Adams argued that the tea must not be unloaded. If it touched the land, the tax would be accepted. The governor of Massachusetts disagreed. He was loyal to Britain. He demanded the tea be delivered. Days passed. The ships remained in the harbor. The law allowed only a short time before the cargo had to be unloaded. Tension grew heavier each night. Meetings became crowded. Voices rose with urgency. What would the colonists do? Would they accept the tea? Or would they take a step that could change history forever? The deadline grew closer. By law, the tea had to be unloaded within 20 days. If not, it would be seized. The owner of the Dartmouth faced a difficult choice. He wanted to sail back to Britain, but the governor refused permission. Without clearance, the ship could not leave the harbor. It was trapped, so were the chests of tea. Meetings were held at the Old South Meeting House. Thousands of people filled the building. The air felt tight and restless. Men stood shoulder to shoulder. Candles flickered against wooden walls. Every word mattered. Samuel Adams spoke calmly but firmly. He said the tea must go back to England. No tax would be accepted, but the governor would not listen. He insisted the law must be followed. The tea must be unloaded. Outside, winter winds swept through Boston streets. Snow gathered along rooftops. The harbor grew colder. Inside homes, families spoke in whispers. Some feared violence. Others believed action was necessary. Few people knew what would happen next, but something was building, something bold. On December 16th, 1773, another large meeting filled the hall. More than 5,000 people attended. The debate lasted for hours. Arguments moved back and forth. The deadline was that very night. As darkness fell, a final message arrived. The governor still refused to send the ships away. Samuel Adams stood before the crowd. His voice was steady. He declared that the meeting could do nothing more. Some say it was a signal, a quiet agreement, a moment of decision. Outside, a group of men began to move. They covered their faces. They dressed as Mohawk Native Americans. The disguises were simple. Blankets, feathers, darkened skin. They were not perfect. The purpose was clear. They wanted to hide their identities and show they were American, not British. In small groups, they walked toward Griffin's Wharf. The harbor lay silent ahead. The moon shone over the frozen water. The ships rocked gently. The night felt still. The first group climbed onto the Dartmouth. They moved quickly but calmly. No one shouted. Crew members watched in silence. They were not attacked. They were not harmed. The men found the tea chests, heavy wooden boxes stacked below deck. Hundreds of them, with axes in their hands. They broke the locks, wood cracked sharply in the cold air. The lids flew open. Inside were tightly packed tea leaves, dark and dry. One by one, the chests were lifted. They were carried to the rail. Then, without hesitation, the tea was dumped into the harbor. It spilled like a dark waterfall. The water turned brown. Tea leaves floated on the surface. The smell spread across the docks. The men worked for hours, from ship to ship, Dartmouth, Eleanor, and Beaver. They were organized. They did not steal anything. They damaged only the tea. More than 300 chests were destroyed. The value was enormous. Thousands of pounds lost. Crowds watched from ashore. Some cheered softly. Others stood in stunned silence. Snow began to fall again. It covered footprints on the docks. The night hid their actions. When the last chest was emptied, the men swept the decks clean. They left the ships in order. No one was killed. No one was seriously injured. But the message was loud. This was not simple protest. It was open defiance, a direct challenge to British authority. The next morning, Boston Harbor looked different. Tea leaves still floated on the water. News traveled quickly. Messengers rode to nearby towns. Word spread across the colonies. Some colonists were proud. They saw courage and strength, a stand for rights. Others felt uneasy. They worried about consequences. Britain would not ignore this. In London, officials received reports of the destruction. Their reaction was immediate. The king was furious. The loss was more than money. It was an insult. Parliament believed order must be restored. If Boston was not punished, other colonies might rebel too. Few people understood how serious the response would be. The protest was over, but the real conflict had just begun. In Boston, life seemed calm again on the surface. Ships still came and went, but soldiers were watching. Officials were planning. Letters crossed the Atlantic. Families continued their routines. Teacups sat on wooden tables. Yet the taste felt different. The harbor was no longer just a port. It had become a symbol, a place of resistance. What happened next surprised everyone. Britain did not choose compromise. It chose punishment. The tea that floated in the cold water had carried more than leaves. It had carried the beginning of war. In early 1774, British ships sailed toward Boston again, but this time they carried orders. Parliament passed new laws. They were strict and severe. The goal was control. The first law closed Boston Harbor. No ships could enter or leave. Trade stopped overnight. The port was the city's lifeline. Without trade, food and supplies became scarce. Dock workers stood idle. Warehouses grew silent. The economy froze. Another law changed the colony's government. Local meetings were restricted. Power shifted to the royal governor. Judges and officials were now appointed by Britain. Colonists felt their voices fading, their control slipping away. A third law allowed British soldiers to stay in private homes if needed. Families feared strangers at their doors. Together, these laws were called the Coercive Acts. In America, they had another name, the Intolerable Acts. The message was clear. Boston would suffer until the tea was paid for. But instead of fear, something else began to grow. Unity. Other colonies watched closely. They saw Boston's punishment. They felt its weight. Food shipments arrived from neighboring towns. Grain, cattle, and rice were sent north. Boston was not alone. Letters traveled between colonies. Leaders shared ideas and warnings. Communication increased. For the first time, colonies began to think of themselves as one people, not separate provinces. In September 1774, representatives gathered in Philadelphia. They formed the First Continental Congress. Men from 12 colonies sat together. They debated rights and responsibilities. They spoke carefully. Some still hoped for peace. They wanted compromise. They wanted fairness. Others believed conflict was unavoidable. They saw Britain's actions as tyranny, a threat to freedom. The Congress sent a petition to the king. It asked for rights to be respected. It asked for the laws to be removed. But Britain did not step back. Instead, more soldiers were sent to America. Red coats filled the streets. Boston became a military town. Drums echoed through narrow roads. Bayonets shone in the sunlight. Tension hung in the air. Colonists watched the soldiers closely. Trust disappeared. In towns across New England, local militias began to train. Farmers practiced with muskets. Gunpowder was collected quietly. Weapons were hidden in barns. Preparation was silent, but serious. The strange part was, most people still did not want war. They wanted respect. But misunderstandings grew deeper. Each side believed it was right. Each side feared losing control. British leaders believed firm action would restore order. Colonists believed resistance would protect liberty. The gap widened. In April 1775, British troops marched out of Boston. They had secret orders. Their mission was to seize colonial weapons stored in the town of Concord. They hoped to prevent rebellion. But word spread quickly. Riders moved through the night. Warnings reached the countryside. One of those riders was Paul Revere. He galloped under the moonlight. His message was urgent. The British are coming. The alarm echoed across villages. Militiamen prepared. At dawn, British soldiers met colonial fighters. On the green in Lexington, no one knows who fired first. A single shot broke the silence. History changed in that moment. The shot was small, but its echo was powerful. It began open fighting. More battles followed that day. At Concord's North Bridge, colonial forces pushed back. British troops retreated toward Boston. They were fired upon from fields and forests. The countryside resisted. The conflict was no longer political debate. It was war, real and dangerous. News of the battles traveled fast. Colonies understood what had begun. There was no easy return. The Second Continental Congress met soon after. This time, the mood was different, more serious. George Washington was chosen to lead the army. He was tall and calm, a symbol of unity. Militiamen became soldiers. They gathered outside Boston. They surrounded the city. The harbor that once held tea now held warships. Cannons faced the land. Months passed in tension. Supplies ran low on both sides. Winter was harsh. Families were divided. Some supported independence. Others remained loyal to Britain. Brothers argued. Neighbors mistrusted neighbors. The conflict entered homes. All of it had roots in a protest over tea. A single night of defiance. Few people in 1773 could have imagined this result. The scale was unimaginable. The tea that darkened Boston Harbor had spread its color far beyond the water. It had spread across a continent. By the summer of 1776, the idea of independence was no longer a whisper. It was spoken openly. In Philadelphia, delegates gathered again. The air felt heavy with decision. They debated for days. Some feared the power of Britain. Others feared losing their freedom forever. Then a document was written, clear and bold. It declared separation. The Declaration of Independence was signed. The colonies no longer saw themselves as subjects. They called themselves states. War continued for years. Battles were fought on fields and rivers. Losses were painful. Winter camps tested endurance. Soldiers lacked shoes and food, but they did not give up. Across the ocean, Britain faced other pressures. The war grew expensive. France entered the conflict. Spain followed later. The struggle widened. What began as protest had become a global war. Empires were involved. In 1781, a major battle took place at Yorktown. British forces were surrounded. After weeks of fighting, a surrender was signed. The war was ending. 2 years later, a treaty was completed in Paris. Britain recognized American independence. A new nation had been born. Its beginning was complex, its path uncertain. But the strange part was, the spark had not been a battlefield. It had been a harbor. It had not been a cannon. It had been tea, simple tea. The protest in Boston was about more than leaves and water. It was about voice. It was about who decides, who has power, who must obey. The tea tax was small in cost, but large in meaning. It represented control from far away. When the chests were broken open, colonists were breaking more than wood. They were breaking silence. Few people that night could see the long road ahead. War, independence, new government. History often turns on quiet choices. Small objects, simple acts. A cup of tea seems harmless, warm, comforting. Yet inside that cup can live ideas of freedom or ideas of control. The Boston Tea Party became a symbol. not only for America, but for protest worldwide. It showed that economic decisions can carry political weight. Trade can shape destiny. It also showed risk. Resistance brings consequences. Change demands courage. Today, the harbor is calm again. Tourists walk along the water. Ships still sail. Few can imagine tea floating across its surface. Brown leaves and icy waves. Museums tell the story quietly. Wooden ships are rebuilt. Children listen with wide eyes. The world has changed since 1773. Empires have risen and fallen. Borders have shifted, but questions about power remain. Who has the right to decide? Who must follow? The tea that started a war was not powerful by itself. People made it powerful. Their beliefs gave it meaning. Their actions gave it force. Their unity gave it strength. In the end, history is shaped by choices, often simple ones. A refusal to unload cargo, a meeting in a crowded hall, a night walk to the docks. From these small steps came a new nation and a new chapter in world history. The story reminds us that everyday objects can carry extraordinary consequences. A letter, a loaf of bread, a cup of tea. So the next time you lift a warm cup, pause for a moment. Remember its history. Remember the harbor at night, the sound of breaking wood, the splash in cold water. Remember the idea behind the act, a demand to be heard, a call for representation. The tea that started a war still whispers its lesson. Power is never only about force. It is also about voice, about dignity, about choice. History is not only kings and armies. It is ordinary people making difficult decisions. And sometimes, those decisions begin quietly. In a harbor at night, the water closes over the leaves. The moonlight fades, but the impact remains. From tea to protest, from protest to revolution, from revolution to independence. All connected, all unfolding step by step, all beginning with a simple tax. If this story made you curious, stay with us for more journeys into history. There are many quiet sparks waiting to be discovered.